Let me introduce myself. I used to work at Google. I then ran my startup FutureCam for a few years. I then worked as CTO of a startup. I now work as a part-time CTO with multiple companies. I'd like to discuss encapsulation today. Encapsulation is a critical technique in programming. It's useful in big teams where you want to enforce certain separation between teams, right? Or separation between parts of the code managed by different sub-teams. Everyone shouldn't be messing with everything, right? But the same principle also applies in a smaller team, even in a one-person project, because you have a certain design idea in mind. You have a certain idea of modules, and you want to maintain these boundaries. Some people like Paul Graham say that encapsulation is not for smart engineers. As I understood his point, maybe I'm misunderstanding, but that's what I took away from one of his essays. I don't agree with that. Even if you're a single engineer, you have multiple layers in your system, no matter how smart you are. We all have a limited ability to deal with complexity. So when you encapsulate, you make things simple. You have a class or a module that's complicated on the inside, but the insides are encapsulated, so it's easy to use on the outside. It's like making a phone call. There's a lot of complexity going on in the network, in secure connections, in routing audio, in servers, all these things, right? But it's easy for you as a user to make a call. I would say code that doesn't use encapsulation at all, where everything is public or whatever, is bad code. With that in mind, let's look at some examples. First, in a class, let's look at this class. I'm using Swift. The concepts apply to all languages. In this class, you should have private variables because otherwise the class as a whole cannot guarantee a certain behavior if everyone is going to reach into the class and modify its internals. So you need to have private variables like this and private functions. This is just a helper function to be invoked somewhere else. Here, the callback. And I also put the private members of the class at the end. And I have this mark private. So in Xcode, you have this. Okay, it's not working, but sometimes you see a separator here and then it says private. I think it shows in other classes. Okay, never mind, that's not working. But when you read the class as a user of the class, you see what you need to know. You don't need to know these. These are at the end. Another level of access control is private set, which is something that only this class can modify, but others can read. And this is important when it comes to state. You don't want other classes performing uncontrolled state changes of this class. If your language doesn't have it, you need to make a private implementation variable and a public accessor, a public getter. But the same concept, right, should be applied. Another level of access control in Swift is file private, which is, as the name says, private to this file. In this case, the file is a class, so it's the same thing. But in other cases, when there are multiple functions in the file, it makes a difference. Types should also be private, not just variables and functions. Make everything as private as needed. So this is a state. So when you're recording a video or a burst in a camera app, what are the states of the shutter button? It has not been pressed. Pressed, right? The user is holding it down. He's in the process of capturing a burst. And there's a special stopped state where the recording has stopped and the shutter button has returned to its release state. So it's back to the first state, right? But those are two different states. For whatever implementation reasons, we needed to separate out. Not yet pressed and completed. So in this case, this enum being file private can be used by this class. Oops. This is an example of a file with some file private stuff. Here there is some global stuff also. So here file private matters, right? In the earlier case, the file consisted of just one class. So instead of making it file private, it could have been private within that class. But here, since there are things at the global level, all this stuff, it makes sense. This is a case where file private lets you do something that private doesn't. In this case, you have two levels of access control. You have a private static date formatter, which uses a certain formatting, and you have this function that invokes this. So in this case, because it is private and not file private, you know at a glance that whatever is above in this file will not be using this. It's only accessible here. So you can see how it helps readability as well, and it eases refactoring because now I can rename this as an example and just change it here. Suppose I want to call it exif formatter for whatever reason. There. Now I'm sure this refactoring is correct because there's no other place where it can be accessed. In addition to file private set, you can also have, in addition to private set, you can also have file private set. In this case, it's the same thing, but in a different case, it can make a difference. Anyway, I just wanted to highlight the importance of encapsulation. It's one of the fundamental techniques, and using it well, using all the features in your programming language, makes a difference. One more thing you'll notice is Swift also has an internal level of access control. It doesn't say public class. That means it is part of the module. It is accessible only within the module. Swift uses modules. A module is just a bunch of classes that are built by the same team. Classes, functions, variables, whatever, right? Some set of code that has one purpose. Think of it as a library. The default access control level in Swift, which is what you get if you don't put any qualifier here like public, is internal, which means internal to the module. And this project is all one module. So all of these can use the IRP controller. It's accessible everywhere, but it's not public. In this case, since this is not a library, this is an app, no other developer is going to import this code. It doesn't make a difference. But if you are making a library or an API, like a client SDK, then it matters, right? You want whatever is your internal API implementation detail to be encapsulated within the module. So all your classes can use it, but not the end users classes or functions. So anyway, this is about encapsulation. If you want to explore whether to work with me, there's a link in the description. And happy Deepavali.